The program is about to begin. At this time, please turn off all electronic devices. Please refrain from using flash photography during the program. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tony Penny, and I have the honor of serving as the Chief Learning Officer here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. And before we introduce our speakers tonight, I'd ask that you all please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Please be seated. I want to take a quick moment to recognize a special guest who's in our audience tonight. The Executive Director of the White House Correspondents Association, Mr. Stephen Thoma, is joining us this evening, so thank you for being here tonight. Well, tonight our topic of this town hall is the presidency and the press, from Reagan to Trump. And in a moment, I'll introduce our speakers who, by virtue of their experience, their professionalism, and their scholarship, can shed much more light on this topic than I could ever hope to do. However, as a former history teacher, I do feel it is my duty to point out that the relationship between the president and the press has been complicated since the very beginning of our country. For example, in 1787, about 14 years before he became president, Thomas Jefferson wrote, quote, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." His opinion might have changed over time, though, because in 1806, during his second term in office, he wrote, "As for what is not true, you will always find in abundance in the newspapers." Fast forward to Ronald Reagan, nearly 180 years later. The press has changed from newspapers and pamphlets to radios and televisions that could broadcast instantly across the country and around the world. In October of 1983, during National Newspaper Week, President Reagan said, "There is no more essential ingredient than a free, strong, and independent press to our continued success in what the Founding Fathers called our experiment in self-government." But earlier in the year, according to a January '83 article in the New York Times, David Gergen, who was then White House Director of Communications, shared that President Reagan had reportedly said, "I've had it up to my keister with these leaks." Well, 2019 will mark 30 years since President Reagan has left office, and though it hasn't been nearly 2 centuries, the rate of change when it comes to the presidency, the press, the speed of communication has all changed very drastically. What does it all mean? Well, that's what our panel tonight is going to explore, and what a panel we have for you tonight. First up, we have Professor John Woolley, Professor of Political Science at UC Santa Barbara and co-director of the American Presidency Project website, arguably the premier web repository of presidential public papers. His research is focused on the American presidency and presidential communication. He also served on the Academic Advisory Council for the Reagan Foundation's Leadership in the American Presidency program, which operates in Washington, D.C. Professor John Woolley. Also joining us is Jonathan Karl, Chief White House Correspondent for ABC News and a regular contributor to programs like Good Morning America, World News Tonight, and Nightline. Also host of a weekly podcast called Powerhouse Politics, and he will serve as the president of the White House Correspondents Association during the 2019-2020 term. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan Karl. Next, we have a wonderful friend to the Reagan Foundation, Lou Cannon. Lou was the senior White House correspondent for the Washington Post during the Reagan administration, as well as one of the foremost biographers of President Ronald Reagan, Mr. Lou Cannon. And finally, we have our moderator, Margaret Talev is the White House correspondent for Bloomberg News and serves as president of the White House Correspondents Association. She also has a strong local connection, having covered Ventura County for the LA Times. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Margaret Talev.
Well, everyone, on behalf of all of us, we just wanted to say, and the White House Correspondents Association, we wanted to say thank you so much to all of you for being here. And before we get started with our conversation, I just wanted to talk to you for a minute a little bit about how we came to be here today and what we hope that you can offer us and what we hope that we can offer you. For many years, the White House Correspondents Association was a small, quiet nonprofit that mostly operated behind the scenes, little dinner once a year. Maybe you tuned in, maybe you didn't. We did education outreach, mostly in Washington, to students or members of the community who might be interested in things like what's the inside of Air Force One like. And then most of what we did was just negotiate like behind the scenes stuff, like where the photographer is going to stand on the riser when the president walks in. But over the course of the last couple of years, that's changed slightly, and people have suddenly become more interested in both the presidency and the relationship between the presidency and the press. And we thought it was both important to and saw an opportunity to get outside the Beltway and talk to more Americans about what we see and about your questions and about who we are and what we do. And so in trying to figure out what's the best way to do that, we thought, well, presidential libraries would be the best way to do that. And before I go any further, I want to thank Tony and Joanne and Rebecca and Megan and the entire staff and team and volunteer corps here at the Reagan Library and Foundation for your support and setting this program up and your interest in working with us on this program. I got to be here last night also to meet some high school scholars who were being honored by the foundation. They were an incredible bunch of kids who made me feel like I've never done anything good for anyone in my life or ever accomplished anything. And they were also incredibly curious with a million questions about what's President Trump like and what's being a reporter like. And so we saw a real opportunity not just for us to share with other people what we do, but to hear your questions and to hear what do you like about White House coverage? What do you want to see more of? What do you want to see less of? What are your thoughts and feelings? And so, again, we thought, well, presidential libraries would be great. That's what we should do. And so we decided to embark on a new program, and if it worked, maybe it was something that future presidents might continue. Our colleague Olivier Knox, who will succeed me in July, would have loved to be here and says hi to everyone. He had a family obligation that he had to travel for. And of course, John, all the three of us all have loved the beginning of this outreach that we've been doing and the ability to engage with people. So we had, so our first two thoughts were, well, let's do the Reagan Library and the Truman Library because they're iconic presidents and great libraries, but also because one's in the middle of the country, one's on the West Coast, and that way we span the country and then we start working our way in. But originally we thought, let's come to the Reagan Library in like February when it's cold and terrible everywhere else. And then let's go to Independence, Missouri in the spring, like maybe around May. And somehow like we got all mixed up and it was freezing in Independence, and it's always beautiful in Southern California. But our audience at the Truman Library was a great first test group. We got a crowd of, several hundred people who were incredibly warm and welcoming and thoughtful and had a lot of great questions. And we look forward to the same interaction with you. And we hope that after tonight is over and after we do our moderated discussion and hear some of your input and questions, we hope that we can stay in touch with you. We hope that if any of you are in Washington and want to connect with us or just have a question about how to contact someone or how to do something, that you'll reach out to us and that we can continue to have a dialogue and build a relationship and stay in touch. So, and also I think one thing that's been on all of our minds lately, and this is something we talked about with the kids last night, is the idea of public engagement and the value of civility and listening and learning. So we're certainly committed to that, and we're really delighted to be here with all of you tonight. Steve Thoma, who you got to meet very briefly, is going to outlast all of us long after we're gone from the board. So we also really encourage you to connect with Steve after our panel. He was a longtime White House correspondent. He was my former reporting partner. He was my senior partner. He's just a year or two older than me. And it was a former president of the WHCA and also won a Gerald Ford Prize for coverage of the White House and explaining the process of how the White House exists to everyday readers. So he's an incredible resource, and I hope we can share him with all of you also. So with that, I'm going to sit down over here and begin this conversation. We'll talk for a little while, and then maybe just as we're talking, whatever comes into your mind that you want to jump off with, the second half of our program, we will do it that way and look very much forward to taking your questions or hearing your input. So thank you again for being here. I'm going to start with you, Lou.
Sure. We should stay here, right?
What's that?
Stay here.
Yeah, we'll stay right here. So what I wanted to start with is the idea of personality and charisma, because from my vantage point, almost every American president in recent memory gets compared with other American presidents. I sometimes hear the comparison of President Trump with President Reagan. And to my eye, I see some similarities. I see someone with a lot of charisma and personality, and that's part of how they govern. And I see someone who has the possibility to completely reimagine what the Republican Party is. But I'm not sure I'm not sure how much more comparison I see beyond that. And I wanted to ask you about that since you have covered Reagan for so long.
Well, what I see when I look at Presidents Reagan and Trump are contrast, not similarities, but differences. Ronald Reagan, I don't mean to offend anybody in here who's a Trump supporter, but Ronald Reagan was a moral man. He had a core to him. And we were all aware of that, even when he maybe you could say there's a similarity in that he got his facts scrambled sometime, but he had an absolute core. There was an absolute core to Reagan. Walter Lippmann once said that de Gaulle was like a nearsighted person. He could see across the room, and Reagan was like that. He'd stumble over the furniture up close sometimes. Right. He was okay at middle distance, but he could see way across the room. He came into office believing something that neither the liberals nor the conservatives believed at the time, which was that the Soviet Union was not 10 feet tall, that the Soviet Union was in fact in perilous shape because their command economy couldn't sufficiently feed their people. And he believed, and he said this before he was president. He came to the Washington Post and said that if we build up the armaments, the Soviets will come to the bargaining table. Now, there were a lot of people at the time who were saying we ought to build, that we were falling behind militarily. In fact, President Carter gets a very bad rap on that because the military buildup that is rightly credited to Ronald Reagan began under Jimmy Carter. But Reagan was saying something different. He was saying that this was a means to an end, and that the end was he, as most of you here know, he and Mikhail Gorbachev, who were way ahead of their teams, wanted to reduce nuclear weapons and signed a treaty. And I say this to people because we're all so worried about the way this world is going, and I'm worried too. But last year, when Putin and Obama, and when we're in 2016, before we're saying bad things about each other, and all of this year, we're still inspecting Soviet missiles in the heart of Russia. And they are inspecting missiles at Vandenberg, and it doesn't even get in the papers. And that's the achievement of Reagan and Gorbachev. That's the achievement of the INF Treaty. Reagan actually had a sense of that when he came in. He had an economic sense. He had goals that were quite clear. And I think goals are different than campaign positions. I'm going to build a wall on Mexico, or I'm going to put everybody give everybody health care. I think a goal is something you can't quite see how you're going to get there. I mean, nobody saw how we're going to get, but Reagan had a sense of it. And I think somehow America had a sense of it. And I don't know whether we did at the White House Correspondents. I don't know whether we did or not. I mean, we're covering I was a reporter at tiny little newspapers, Merced and Walnut Creek, and then San Jose. I worked for other papers for 15 years before I went to Washington Post. And the sense of reporting's the same everywhere. That you have to be accurate, you should be fair, you have to be skeptical. The same verities apply to a reporter in Washington and Podunk. But the president is different than any other official you cover. The president is as Howard Lasky called him, he's the advocate of the American people. He's like he exists. We call him Mr. That's a high title in the United States. He is supposed to represent all of us. And presidents are alternately frustrated by those of us in the press. And on the days they're not frustrated, they're thinking of ways to use us. How can they get their message
Well, actually, that doesn't sound so unfamiliar.
And so I think that covering this is a long-winded answer, I'm sorry for it. Covering the White House, I always felt it was a special responsibility. I thought it was important to do, and I thought that the president, what he did and what he didn't do and how well we could describe him was really, really vital. And I think that in addition to having a core value, where I think Reagan shined is he had a sense of country, but he had a sense of people. He actually liked reporters. That's not because he liked reporters. That's because he liked everybody, and we were part of the everybody. And he didn't hold a grudge. You know how you go in and you hear, if you were watching Jonathan Karl nightly, as I do, you're seeing Jonathan's always having to tell us what Trump said about something on some other day, and he remembers you, and he remembers what you wrote or what you put on the air. And I wrote a year after, and I'll stop. I wrote a year after Reagan took office. I've been on leave writing a book, and one of the editors said, Ben Bradley said, I want you to write something when you come back here that will get noticed. And I wrote that the question with Reagan when he got elected was whether he was up to the job, and the question a year later, that's still the question. That did not go over well with Reagan or many of the people at the White House. But it didn't make any difference either. You could write the worst thing about President Reagan one day, and when you came in the next day, it was a clean slate. He knew what your job was. And one of Jonathan's distinguished predecessors was a guy named Sam Donaldson, whom you all remember. And I was going in the White House one day for a book interview, and Sam had been pestering Reagan in some back and forth in the Rose Garden, and these staffs all saying, "Oh, how terrible Sam is." And Reagan said, he wasn't where I was there even. Apropos of nothing, he just said, "Oh, lay off Sam. He's got a job to do."
That's awesome.
Reagan always realized we had a job to do.
You're right. That part's a little different. John, let's jump off of that from there. When you, having gotten to know President Trump before he was even candidate Trump,
Yeah.
what's your sense of which presidents he admires most or emulates most, or do you think he thinks about it like that?
First of all, I've got to say, I think that I've known Donald Trump for a good 25 years, and I've had the amazing privilege of having worked in the White House on and off for now President Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump. I mean, 4 people that are about as different as you can possibly imagine in that role. And I don't think that Trump thinks about history very much. I don't think. I was telling, and by the way, I could sit here and just listen to Lou Cannon.
All night.
I mean, could you do that? I mean, and what an honor to be here at the Reagan Library and to have a chance to take a step back and think about those big questions. The news cycle is so intense right now. I mean, we are dealing with, on some days, 3 or 4 or 5 storylines, any one of which could dominate the network news, could be the banner headline on the New York Times or the LA Times. And, you know, it's just to come back and to just take a step back and to sit next to somebody like Lou Cannon and talk about how it all kind of fits in. But I think that, you know, to your point about Reagan liking the press, Trump actually likes the press. I mean, you know, he calls us the enemy of the people and says we're terrible, outrageous, horrible human beings. He actually is somebody who likes reporters. I mean, he sneered at me the other day in the Oval Office, stupid question, with Macron in the Oval Office. I was pulled that day. And, you know, God bless him, the one thing he will do is he will take questions. And he will take questions from people he recognizes. And I do have a relationship with him, and he will, but he didn't like the question I asked. And, you know, that's a stupid question. The next day, he was answering another question from me. So, but I do worry. I spent a lot of time actually deeply concerned with the fact that you do have a president of the United States who has declared essentially a free press the enemy of the people. And he has a lot of people who think very highly of him and who hear those words and take those words very literally. I know that Donald Trump does not mean those words in that way because, again, he'll come and he'll be very civil. We'll engage you right after
handshakes.
having,
Would you like a Diet Coke?
But
No, that's true. It's true.
But there are two sides of this that worry me. It's not just that you have the most powerful man in the world, or in America, or the most powerful man we cover, declaring a free press, which is so central to what it means to American democracy, to be the enemy of the people. But you also have Steve Bannon, when he was the chief strategist, said something in an interview shortly after Trump became president. He said that the media is the opposition party. And that was deeply disturbing to me because we are not the opposition party. We are all the things that Lou just said. We try to get the facts. We're skeptical. We can be pretty damn negative. I mean, that's what Teddy Roosevelt complained of. You know, Teddy Roosevelt coined the term muckrakers. You know, the press being the man with the muck rake, always looking down, raking the muck, and never looking up and seeing the glorious things that were happening, just looking at the bad things. So we are negative and we are skeptical, and sometimes we do miss the bigger picture. That's why we need people like Lou Cannon. But we cannot act like the opposition party. If we do, then we're falling into exactly what those negative portrayals say we are. We are not the opposition party. I have tangled with press secretaries in both parties. And right now, I will occasionally, I don't know if you remember Sean Spicer, do you remember? I mean, I will occasionly, get in some pretty heated exchanges in that briefing room, and stories that the White House would see, or like Lou's story writing about does Reagan have it, seeing as way too negative. That's not because I'm trying to be the opposition to Donald Trump. I'm trying to report on what's going on, and I'm trying to have that, and I'm bringing that the journalist skepticism. But I can't be the opposition party, and I did the same thing in the
Obama administration.
In the briefing room of the Obama administration. I mean, Jay Carney. It got incredibly heated at times. But That's why I love your anecdote about what Reagan said about Sam Donaldson, who could be more annoying than anybody in that briefing room, right? He's doing his job, and that is our job. And it's not just our job, it's not just our paycheck, it's essential to the workings, I think, of our democracy. But what I worry about, coming back to that notion of the opposition party, is that we have to be careful not to fall into that. And you know, it's hard when you're covering somebody who is declaring you not just too negative, but an enemy. But you have to treat that president with respect and strive to be fair, and
Even if they don't treat you with respect.
Even if it's not coming back, because we're not to fall into that. And you know, we've got to do what Reagan did, and just kind of forget that and go. And I'm going to do the story and report the good and the bad, and to be skeptical, but do the job of a journalist.
It's funny. Before I moved to John Woolley, you just made me think of an anecdote. But I was on this trip to Indiana a few days ago. What was that? Just like a few days ago, wasn't it? When was that? Monday or something? I don't know. I lost track.
Every day is like a month.
Tuesday. But the president and Vice President Pence were going to Indiana. It was a campaign trip, so we took Little Air Force One because I pay for it. And we went, and they were promoting a newly minted Republican nominee to try to unseat the Democratic senator from the state. And the president was talking about how his new slogan isn't "Make America Great Again" because he's made it great again. Now it's "Keep America Great." So whatever, that all happened. And you know, we'd all been on the plane together and had talked with administration officials on the flight out. And as we were waiting for the event to start, several of us are in the audience or reaching over the rope line to meet with audience members, take out a notebook, tell us why you're here, how do you think the president's doing, you know, what do you like, what do you not like, whatever. It's all very friendly, it's great. And he gets in his speech, and he gets to the part where it's like, you know, and the media, and everyone starts booing, people are staring at us, and it's like, okay. And you just work through it.
Look at an entire crowd like taunting
But they were like, but it's like
sneering at
a woman who was very nice 5 minutes ago, and it's like, oh, it's great to meet you, and then you like turn around and she's like, boo, you know. But this is the new. It's like the new form. It's not funny. It's honestly not. It's kind of heartbreaking, but you got to let it roll off of you because your job is not to be popular or even necessarily understood. It is just to report the news.
Yeah.
Okay, this is uplifting. Maybe we can make it a more uplifting conversation. John Woolley is one of the great experts in this country about presidential statistics spanning all administrations. And I know that part of what you've been watching is how press interactions with this president have differed from some predecessors and many other metrics. And I'm just wondering now, about a year and a half into the administration, what stands out to you? What do you think are some of the most interesting things that you've found?
Well, first of all, let me just say how cool it is to be here with these people, because it's as cool as it is for you to be here with those people. So this president is a different president, and he's you know, Tony introduced us by talking about historical views on the presidency, and one of the things that's true about presidents over time is that whenever there's some kind of a technological innovation, before long, you find a president who knows how to take advantage of that and to use that in a way that nobody ever did before, and to do it successfully.
Are you talking about Twitter?
And I'm talking about Twitter. Right? And so Donald Trump is so different in his communication because Twitter is so important to him. In his up to this point in office, he has had one news conference.
Yeah.
One news conference.
It was a hell of a news conference.
It's
17 different reporters called on. It was a hell of a news conference.
And
It was enough to last all 4 years. Come on, let's be honest. He does do the shorter ones, the foreign leader news conferences, a couple of questions from each country. But
Yes,
you're right.
he does do those joint news conferences, but he does those at a lower rate than his predecessors have done.
How much lower? What are we talking about here?
Well, okay, let me see if I can give you that. I'm not sure if I have that averaged for the joint news conferences separately.
No, that's okay. We'll take it all.
But at this point, he's doing, he's averaging per month a little bit under 2 joint news conferences, which is, Ronald Reagan didn't do any joint news conferences. Right. Joint news conferences, nothing was labeled as a joint news conference in the Reagan administration. So that's a post-Reagan sort of phenomenon. And so Trump is doing those at a lower rate. So no president has approached the press in those kind of formal settings. As John mentioned, he takes questions. He invites people into his cabinet meetings or meetings that he has. Sometimes he takes questions. He gives a speech of some sort. But
we've seen meetings where he has the press come in for the entire meeting.
And that's a remarkable thing. You don't know that you don't know in advance that that's going to happen, and all of a sudden he's there. Let's watch the whole meeting. So this is just a totally different kind of style of operating. One of the things we have been looking at, though, that's sort of relevant to this question about the relationship between the administration and the reporters, is we have accumulated the transcripts of the daily press briefings, or sometimes it's more than one a day, press briefings that are put out by the White House, and have begun to try to analyze those. We have these starting with the Clinton administration. And so the rate at which these press briefings happen is pretty much the same as in prior administrations. One of the things we're interested in is trying to find little indicators of disagreement, of tension between the press and the press briefer. And so there are 2 of them that are pretty easy to get and that we've done some preliminary work on. And one of them is interruptions. So the transcript indicates when somebody has interrupted somebody, when they're talking over. And so we can look at those. And the other thing is the transcribers record laughter. So there's actually laughter that happens in these press briefings. There's really not much difference between what's going on in the Trump White House press briefings in terms of laughter and interruptions than goes on in the George W. Bush administration on average. The same kind of rate of laughter, the same kind of rate of interruptions. What's pretty striking in the data is a difference, not in interruptions, but in laughter between Obama-Clinton and Bush-Trump.
How so?
There's a lot less laughter. A lot less interruptions for laughter in the press interactions with the Republican briefers.
Wait. Oh, there's less laughter? Or
less laughter.
Less laughter with Republicans than with Democratic administrations?
Yep.
What do you think it means?
I don't know. Democrats are funnier? I don't know. That's the only obvious conclusion I can think of. And we don't know whether the laughter is being provoked by, we haven't analyzed.
But it's striking to me because your point that this is a different presidency.
Yes.
You cannot use the same metrics.
You can't. And
it's true. He's had one single, what we would call traditional press conference. Right. But in some ways, he is the most accessible president that I've ever seen of the 4 that I've had a chance to cover. I mean, the meeting that I mentioned where he brought the congressional leadership in to negotiate on immigration. Now these can be tense meetings. Guys like Luke Hannon will be reporting about this like 10 years later. Usually, what happened in such a meeting, they get some, and in this case, the way I was in, because I was the network pool that day. So I go in for what I think is going to be a quick little photo op, and I end up in the cabinet room for over an hour while the president is going back and forth with congressional leaders in both parties and seeming to give away the store on immigration. And it's all playing out before the cameras. And at one point, Kevin McCarthy, the Republican majority leader in the House, it says to the president, shouldn't we let them out, let them go? And I've known McCarthy for a long time. I was like, what are you doing to me, Kevin? Come on, we're here. And he keeps us in for well over an hour. And yet,
It didn't help
Let me make
his.
a point about the briefings. They are quite different, and I admire what you're trying to do, John. I wish you luck with those. I hope you do better with the White House transcripts than I ever did.
Yeah.
But the briefings in our day, I covered the fall of Nixon, and I covered the Ford presidency, and I covered Reagan, and I covered a little of Carter. So I also had was exposed to 4 presidents, and they were all different. But the briefing as an institution was quite different. In those days, cameras were not allowed in the briefings. I don't know when they started, but at the end of the Reagan administration, they still didn't have cameras. I always had the feeling that my friends on the TV side of it fought to have the briefings open to television, but they didn't fight too hard, because the argument that those of us on the print side always made was, well, you're not going to have the same kind of briefings once you open it to television, and you haven't. And some of the briefings, with some of the, I think particularly of when Marlin Fitzwater was the press secretary, he would get my nomination for the best press secretary that I ever dealt with. And a lot of the laughter there would be because Marlin was genuinely funny. He was a funny man, would tell jokes. But, and lots of times those briefings became informative and became interesting because there weren't any cameras on them. Now, it seems to me that Trump's not only accessible, but he's probably more accessible than he realizes, if anything, because, as you say, these were photo ops and things that were you'd get a glimpse of Reagan, and even, except for Gerald Ford, who was always accessible, you didn't see that much of George H.W. Bush and Carter, and you never saw anything of Nixon at those, things. So you were sort of hungry for information in some of the briefings. The briefings now seem to me like they're part of the show.
It's almost like it's flipped on its head, right? That what you're saying is that now we might go to President Trump to try to get the information that we couldn't get out of the briefing, whereas before you'd go to the briefing to get the information that you couldn't get out of the president.
It's quite different, yeah.
well, it is extremely difficult to get reliable information out of this White House.
Yeah.
But part of that's because the message from the top changes.
The message from the top changes. The people, the senior advisors, don't necessarily know what's going on because the president will change course. I mean, one just glaring example was when he announced the steel and aluminum tariffs. And I can tell you this, that the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, and the Chief Economic Advisor, Gary Cohn, both told reporters that morning that the tariffs were not coming. The president had 2 events. One was on his public schedule, one wasn't. The one that was on his public schedule was about guns and school safety. The one that was not on his public schedule, was not even listed, was about the tariffs, meeting with steel and aluminum leaders. And suddenly, boom, that was added to the public schedule. I mean, the meeting was already happening, but it was something we were now told about it, and it was going to be opened up for a quick photo op. The quick photo op turned out to be the president announcing he was imposing steel and aluminum tariffs, something that his top people said just in about an hour earlier was not going to happen. And the congressional leadership had been told it was not going to happen because the president had changed course. I'll give you just one other thing on the 17-question press conference. Do you remember that day? I mean, we had no idea a press conference was going to happen. Suddenly, we were told, hustle in, preset, there's going to be a press conference. I think we had like 90 minutes, which you have to understand, everything's got to be set up. I mean, it
Takes a lot longer than that.
And it was the president suddenly telling his staff, you know what, why don't we just go ahead and have a press conference? And suddenly, thank God I was there and I hadn't gone out and talking, running. I mean, we were running into the East Wing, into the East Room, literally while they were setting up for a press conference. So this is a president who calls audibles, who changes, from minute to minute. That's why it's hard to get reliable information.
Well,
One of the reasons.
At the 1981 Gridiron Dinner, the best line was Reagan's line that said, "Sometimes in our White House, the right hand doesn't know what the far right hand is doing." well, it was a funny line, but it was literally true. And I always thought that the Reagan White House was an accessible White House for people who did the work, because you had to talk to, there were a lot of factions, and you had to talk to all of them. And I won my share of awards and everything, but the one thing that I thought I did that nobody ever mentioned, that I thought was the best thing I did as a reporter, was I resolved that I was not going to be captured by any of these factions. And it wasn't as easy as it seemed, because Jim Baker was the most masterful guy at co-opting reporters, I think, that I've ever seen. I admire Baker as a person. He's honest and he's patriotic, and he's a good family man and all those things. But he would take people into their confidence, and sell them on something, and people would come out believing that they didn't know they'd just been sold something. And so I decided to make sure I kept my lines on it. It was probably easy for me to do because I'd covered Reagan as governor with Ed Meese and the people who were Bill Clark, the people who were considered the far right hand,
right.
And because none of these, because they were not as expert as Baker at co-opting reporters, they weren't very good at that. They didn't come and tell you what they thought. You had to go to them. It was very easy, and this press corps gets I think, a false reputation of trying to prove they're the opposition party. I don't think they are. I think that guys like Jonathan and the other people who cover the White House are very straight. But what the press got the reputation for in the Reagan years, particularly in the first term, was being co-opted by Baker and favoring that side of it. And I think there was some truth in that. I think that was not a wholly invalid charge.
Don't you think that this chaos that we see in the Trump administration it's part of in some sense of a strategy? It's Trump's mode of operating. It's the mode that characterized him before he became a politician. And he never had a big, complicated organizational structure. He believed in surprising people and being spontaneous. And the part of it is, the problem is that from the kind of standard political orderly messaging that White House press are used to dealing with and coping with is not this guy's style. He makes stuff up.
Well, I think
as it goes along.
I think he attacks the press because it works.
He does, yes, actually.
And I think, what I'd like to know, and I don't know that any of us here know it, I'd sure be interested in what you would think as a historian, is when it happened from just the press being sort of the general bad guys, that no politicians liked, to when we became supposedly the opposition voice of the Democrats, of the people on the other side. Because I don't think Trump is the cause of this as much as he's the effect. I think it happened before Trump. And I don't know at what point it happened out there, because I haven't been doing daily journalism for a while.
Well, wasn't the creation of Fox News explicitly on that point?
I think that's right.
It was we are fair and balanced. The point being the other guys are all in the tank for the Democrats.
And Fox News has consistently had a bigger audience than CNN and MSNBC. So you have to think that there are a heck of a lot of people out there who believe that.
You got any data on this?
It's one tiny bit of confirmation, which is that the way Donald Trump talks, and I don't mean in Twitter, I mean in speeches and addresses and remarks, the sort of standard mode presidential events, he uses forms of language that are consistent with this theme, and the theme is the media are the problem. And I think he does that because it's a strategy that works for him politically. He refers to the media and the press, one of those two, 4 or 5 times as often as any of his predecessors did.
Isn't that interesting?
And he uses words like lying, phony, and fake 3 times as much as any of his predecessors have for any given time period. So he's hitting his themes over and over again, and it is I think he sees a political advantage in bringing in sort of characterizing what he's doing as this opposition. And it's a way of trying to undermine,
delegitimize the
credibility
validity
of the message that's coming from you fake news people.
You know, I think that's exactly right. That's and what other presidents have done, and where Trump is, other presidents have all sought to do on some level what my friend Jim Baker does, co-opt reporters. Yep. I mean, they're not. Reagan's most often reference to the New York Times and Washington Post was some paragraph in a story that he found that agreed with him or that advanced his purposes. The story itself may not have, but that was fine with Reagan. If he could get a paragraph that did, he'd quote it. And I think that's pretty much been the modus operandi of, people like Kennedy, who was so thin-skinned that he banned the Herald Tribune from the White House because they'd written something they didn't like. At the time, the New York Herald Tribune was an important paper, and but they still in their dialogue, in their speeches, in their rhetoric, they found things in the press that supported their feelings, their points of view, and advanced them. And this guy he doesn't want that. He's
but there's such a fundamental contradiction because yes, but then he'll bring in the New York Times for an extensive hour-long interview in the Oval Office, or call him up, or bring in, I mean, the very time he's denouncing the specific news organization, and then it's
and that's fascinating, isn't it? Because it means that if you think about what's his goal? His goal is to continually to get his message out and to have him as a character and him as an advocate dominating front pages, whatever that means, of mainstream media. He's very, very effective at making that happen. So it doesn't, he can speak to one audience and draw the battle lines, but that doesn't drive you away. If he calls you up and says, "Do you want to talk?" It's like, yeah. I'll be there.
Any reporter would want to talk to any American president ever.
If he tweets some outrageous thing, it's front page news. It gets.
We're going to turn to questions in a minute, but I want to hit on one theme that we've kind of been dancing around, and it is the question of, and I think it's the question with every president of whether the president is initiating something new himself or reacting to changes that have already happened, and kind of as a corollary, the idea of whether you think let's all bring into this, whether you guys think Ronald Reagan changed the Republican Party and how, and whether you think that Donald Trump is changing the Republican Party and how.
Well, I think that the same thing that I think about. I guess Trump is both a cause and effect. Reagan was certainly both a cause and effect. People have said that. I think George Willis said that Barry Goldwater really won the '64 election. They just didn't count the returns until 1980. And the party was steadily becoming more conservative, and the '78 elections, just as I think I now write about the states, and it's an unwritten, not written about enough, but the Republicans just wiped out the Democrats in the states during the Obama years. They got 1,000 legislative seats. They took, in 2010, cut 24 chambers that they had previously been run by the Democrats. They won or were tied. So I think there was a lot of auguries. Well, in '78, the Republicans had a very good year, and the Democrats had a very bad year. And I think but I think what Ronald Reagan did more than changing the party is that he kind of codified it. That after Ronald Reagan made it okay to be a conservative. You know, afterwards, there are there are people in polls, people who were self-identified conservatives have never been as high as self-identified liberals or self-identified moderates. After Reagan, the numbers started to go up. I don't know that was because there'd been a sea change in the way we thought about individual issues. I think that was because you could be a conservative and be a good guy. You could be a conservative and be an effective president. And I think that's what he did. And he made the Republican Party. I think the Republican, whatever since Republicans have been trying to get back to is those Democrats and the Democrats in the industrial state, who they still called, even in the last election, Reagan Democrats. Mm-hmm. And Trump went out and got them. Yep. Or Hillary lost them, you know, I mean, or both. But that's the change that Ronald Reagan made.
What do you think that President Trump is doing to shape the definition of what it means to be a Republican?
Well, what I wonder is, as you were talking, I was thinking Reagan, think about how many subsequent presidential elections, Republican primaries, we saw people vying to be the next Ronald Reagan or portraying themselves in the mantle of Reagan. Are we going to be seeing that about Trump? I mean, I don't know. I mean,
in Indiana.
What we are seeing is we are seeing candidates,
absolutely,
you know, trying to say I'm Trumpier than he is
yes.
in Republican primaries.
But we now have 85 or 90% of the Republicans saying that they basically agree with Trump. You know, that they're basically supportive of Trump. I'm writing about the Affordable Care Act this week, and I think that's going to be a good issue for the Democrats in November, partly because Trump got rid of the most unpopular part of it, which was the requirement that everybody have health insurance or pay a penalty. But you're not seeing it in the primaries, and you're not seeing this in the primaries because whatever Trump did has become the orthodoxy of the Republican Party in the primaries.
But I just don't know what, I mean, if you look, so you have this, you have this sky-high approval rating among Republican voters for Trump, and yet if you look at what the Republican Party that you've reported on for all these years, that I've reported on, is a different Republican Party. I mean, just go down, just
and
go
was becoming a different
issue
Republican Party
by issue. But I mean, dramatically different positions on trade. We're talking about, I mean, President Trump has gone further on trade than, like, I mean, if we'd had a President Gephardt, you know, was the you know, protectionist wing of the Democratic Party on foreign policy.
But I wonder, Margaret or any of you, does that mean that these issues aren't deeply felt? I mean, I don't know that there's an awful lot of Americans who get, you know, if you lost a job.
Yeah, maybe not. Maybe this was just the elite of the Republican Party. But these were the issues that I mean, trade, control of government spending, entitlement reform, an assertive American foreign policy. You know, Reagan to George W. Bush. These were the core principles of what it meant to be a Republican.
Well, we are seeing an assertive American foreign policy on North Korea.
Yeah, but it's a different.
Israel.
And he's talking about bringing American troops home from South Korea.
Yes.
He's talking.
Yeah, in Syria.
Well, in Syria, but South Korea. I mean, he's floated bringing American troops home even before he's gotten into his negotiations with Kim Jong-un. I mean, you know. He is somebody who has basically gone to NATO and said, look, we've been carrying this for too long. You know, now I mean, it's a very different vision of America's role in the world than Reagan projected and that George W. Bush projected.
But it's an old
It's
view.
an old Robert Taft.
Yeah,
It's like
it's a view. I mean, on the eve of Pearl Harbor,
Yes,
the isolationists were so
were the
strong
Republicans.
that President Roosevelt was muted in his denunciations of them.
but the Republican Party that we have known since Reagan is very
It's
different from the
shifting.
Republican Party that we are seeing.
Well, how do you account for the Rust Belt, the populist, the Democrats, the southeastern Pennsylvania, places that voted heavily for Reagan, haven't voted. They were voted for Obama, and they haven't voted for Republican presidents since at least George H.W. Bush. Some of them didn't vote for George W. Bush, but they voted for Trump. How do you? And that seems to me there's a connection there.
I think it's the charisma question, and that's what I was asking you earlier. That
Economic populism.
The message, his way of explaining the message, resonated because Barack Obama also would go to places that were in the Rust Belt and say, basically his version of "I feel your pain." But Donald Trump speaks in a different way and reached a lot of those voters across the party aisle in that way.
I think the vulnerability of Democrats in the regions that proved decisive was actually demonstrated by Hillary Clinton, not as a presidential candidate last time, but as a candidate against Obama. She won, a lot of those counties in Pennsylvania. And she won a number of counties in Ohio, that were counties that were Trump counties this time. I mean, running against Obama, not Trump.
Yeah, the cling to their Bibles.
The problem is whether Trump is really going to successfully remake the Republican Party in the way that, in some sense, Ronald Reagan did. And Ronald Reagan didn't just remake the Republican Party; he remade American politics.
Mm-hmm.
He redefined the issues in debate. He faced a Democratic New Deal coalition program that had run out of steam and couldn't seem to solve the problems, was personified by a president who told people that they needed to, put on their sweaters and turn down the thermostat. And it didn't have that charisma factor, but he also had a program that I think grew out of a deep sort of Republican organizational base. And a problem, it seems to me, for President Trump is that there's a lot of the mainline core Republicans, O-line Republicans, who, as you just pointed out, disagree with him on a whole bunch of his things. And even though he has very high approval ratings among self-identified Republicans, the question is whether you can continue to win elections only with that core of Republicans.
Well, that's right. We don't even have a midterm under our belts yet. So it's one thing to judge presidency after 8 years, and it's entirely a different matter to try to predict it after a year and a half.
But if he
it's only been a year and a half. Oh,
but if he can't, if he loses control of everything in the midterms, if it's a really big sweeping defeat for Republicans in the midterm, then it's hugely consequential for his presidency and the possibility of sort of rebuilding a Republican Party program.
So on that note, because this is a perfect segue, we wanted to make sure we do have ample time for questions. Tony, how are we going to do this? Or we have a microphone, or how will it work? So please put your hand up, and the team will come to you. Let's start with this gentleman over here. Yeah. So just you gentlemen, hang tight. A microphone is coming your way. And listen, we'd love for you to introduce yourself if you'd like to. If you just want to remain anonymous, that's fine too. But
my name is Stanley Colker.
I know you.
You do?
I do.
I owe you money?
We can talk after.
Same pool room, maybe. Let's turn the clock back about 2 years ago. My failing memory serves me correctly this time. There were 17 people running for president on the Republican side and 3 on the Democrats. I can only remember Hillary's name. I forgot the other 2.
There was a guy named Bernie. Yeah.
And there was a ex-governor from Maryland, I think.
Yeah, O'Malley.
Okay.
Yeah.
What kind of condemnation or praise or rating would you give to the TV media who gave Trump tens of millions of dollars of free airtime tens of millions. You ask how they got the Rust Belt? They heard it on television. Maybe they didn't see his program or You're Fired and stuff like that, but they constantly saw him all the time, and he didn't pay a nickel for that stuff. Did you think the media did the right thing, or did they help make the Trump president of the United States?
It's a great question. Who wants to take a stab, panel?
As the card-carrying member of the, first of all, can we define our terms a little bit? Just to be clear, the networks, ABC News, CBS News, we didn't carry any Trump speeches live. I mean, that was cable news that they carried that. Yes, and that's a good point. I think there's a lot of rethinking of that. But I will say that they were carried because they were compelling and people wanted to watch what he had to say. And Trump was incredibly accessible during that primary process. Ted Cruz, for instance, just to pick another one of the other 17, or the other 16, we couldn't get the guy to do an interview during much of that primary process. Couldn't get a question to some of these because they were being Jeb Bush being so incredibly careful and trying to manage their and Trump was like all out there, and instead of giving a kind of a staid, typical, stump speech, it was you never knew what was going to come out, he did something that was, first of all, he did interviews constantly during the primaries. It changed when he got to the general elections. When you finally got to the vote, when the voting started to happen, he did something that I've never seen in a presidential candidate, at least one that had a chance. Instead of having a victory night, give a speech, thank you voters, and go, he held a press conference. He would take questions on primary night after the, give his little thing and then start taking questions. And he figured something out that the others who were running, old, carefully managed campaigns did not figure out. Did our brethren in cable news take too many of these questions? And the other thing people mention is that they would show pictures of the empty podium and say, "He's coming up soon. Don't go away. He's coming out." Yeah, it was probably too much. It was probably maybe way too much. But he was running a campaign in a way to connect with people that the people running against him couldn't figure out at all. And that's not, you can't blame cable news.
I think we want to jump in real quick,
I share Mr. Coulter's criticism of cable news, but to some degree, the news business always is a constant. I wrote a book a long time ago about reporting, and one of the things that we have a bias toward is novelty. Nobody ever says that. They're writing about ideologically, but in 1972, when I came to the Washington Post 5 weeks before Watergate. That's how a date, and I was covering Hubert Humphrey, and the Humphrey people were furious because all the coverage was going to George Wallace and McGovern. So they said Humphrey had this 42-point program. I went to my editor and told him what Humphrey and the people were saying, and the editor's response is, "We're doing him a favor by not reading." However that may be, in every campaign in which I had a role as a reporter, what's new and different always, and not just in campaigns. I mean, that's it's man bites dog, and that we always that's where we are. The Meg Greenfield, a great editorial writer, editorial page editor and writer for the Boston Post, once said that Spiro Agnew's idea of a good story would be rear wheels stay on 72 Fords or something. So I think Trump was new and Trump was different, and he is different, and I think that's part of part of the answer.
Okay, let's get
Can
another.
I just add one thing, that Trump wasn't just new and different. Trump was different in an incredibly exciting and interesting way.
Entertaining.
If entertaining, he called people's names. We can still remember some of them, you know. Little Marco, No Energy Jeb.
Lion Ted.
Lion Ted, and that stuff is incredibly memorable, and it's great sort of soundbite material. And the opposition, it's still the case. People have not figured out how to deal with that mode of communication and the aggressiveness that's there.
Okay. Let's go this side of the room. So, this gentleman over here. Yes.
Right there, right.
It turns to
right
your left there. There it is.
Okay, if you say so. All right, so you said, Mr. Karl, that it's compelling. You said that it's novel and entertaining. All right, well, you could make the pitch that watching somebody literally commit murder is compelling and novel and maybe even entertaining. But I'm not convinced that that's something you ought to put on television. I'm not convinced it's something that ought necessarily be on the front page just because the guy wants to be there. So I say to you, I wonder how much of a role the press has played in changing the way you report on politics in general and this president in specific because of his novelty, compellingness, his entertainment value as opposed to his newsworthiness.
So we have to define. So what we were talking about is during the course of the Republican primary, when he did get a disproportionate amount of the airtime, particularly on cable news, but also he got a disproportionate amount of the coverage. Period, no question. But the big question was, cable news just rolling his speeches. I don't think that what you've just described is the way he's being covered now. Is that your suggestion? I mean,
Even today.
Well, I mean, I think.
The tweet the man puts is front page news all across the, if not your newspaper or the major networks, it's certainly front page, if you will, news across all of the various cable outlets.
But would you have us ignore the President of the United States?
I didn't say that.
Somebody said yes, right?
Should it be at the top? Should it be so important? Or should it be a little toned down?
I'll say, can I jump in? I'm trying to stay in the moderator's role, not jump in that much. But I'll say that at my news organization, we established something that we didn't really have before. Because President Obama used Twitter, but not that much. It was usually like, please vote for, call your congressman and tell them to support HR, whatever, And so this is a little bit different. And so we established basically an automated thing when it became apparent that the tweets were going to be a thing at 4 a.m. every day. That it was like an electronic alert so that whoever the main editing desk was 24 hours a day that was in charge, if the president or the president-elect and then the president tweeted something, that editing desk would see it. And in the beginning, almost every tweet got an alert on the wire, right? But as time went on, that actually changed. And I think it has changed at other news organizations as well, where it became less automatic and more of a judgment call. Do we move a headline off of that tweet, or do we wait for the third and fourth tweet and try to gather facts and actually figure out whether this rises to the level of a story or not? I actually think that change has begun, but I think that the change in communication was so profound under this politician that it has required news organizations to consider things they had not considered before. And it has taken a while to modulate that behavior, because you want to be a responsible teller of news. You don't want to be free campaign advertising for a candidate, but you also don't want to hold back information that Americans should see and be able to process for themselves. And I think one thing that we have found in the briefing room, this is a slightly different subject, but is along the same spectrum. because I hear the emotion in your voice, and I know that that's real, that you feel, maybe tell me if I'm wrong, but a sense of passion about the subject, a sense of concern about the subject. In our roles, both as reporters and in the association, we get a lot of feedback from Americans about the press briefings. And some people who are strong supporters of the president feel that the press is out to get him in those briefings and that we're awful. And some people who are critics of the president feel that the messaging from that podium across 2 press secretaries now is not fulsome, and that the press should boycott the briefings.
Walk out.
And declare things that are not fulsome answers to be lies, and to use that word, and that not to do that is an abdication of our responsibility. And obviously, both of those things can't be true at the same time. But we have sort of struggled to process both emotions, which are, real, and to try to figure out how do we talk to voters about why we staff briefings and what the purpose is. And the answer that I usually give when we're talking about this is that we also want briefings to contain fulsome information, but that to stop going to the briefing wouldn't make the information more fulsome. It would just give the public less information. That on the flip side, we understand that if you are a supporter of the president and feel that he's easily caricatured or written off, that it's natural that you would get frustrated with the press for not helping or for what you perceive as hurting, but that it is our role, no matter who the president is, to ask critical questions in those briefings and to let the administration answer the way they want to answer. And the thing is about a televised briefing, that's like a fraction of the way reporters report, but it is the only fraction that is transparent, I guess, for the American people. The downside of televising briefings is that everybody plays to the camera. But the upside to the briefings is that it is a chance, if you're just a member of the public, to tune in and watch and to see what are the words that are used, what are the answers that are given, what is the tone, what is the sense of openness or fulsomeness, and you make the judgment. It gives you some power to make a judgment that you couldn't make otherwise, but it also gives you the instinct to react with emotion. And I see the emotion, I hear it, but I think our job is to help try to juggle just letting you see things play out with some analysis that is as neutral as possible, but is just sort of a fact-based analysis. And for us, it's a real challenge. It's very challenging in an emotionally charged atmosphere.
I'm there on the White House North Lawn most days at 7 in the morning to go on Good Morning America to report, whatever the morning story is, the lead story, okay? And he knows that I'm out there, so he starts tweeting at 6:30 in the morning. And what I have tried to do, and I've tried to urge, everybody who I work with, is sometimes when he says something at 6:30, it's going to be important and we're going to have to report it. But other times, you know what? We've got our story. So we have to be aware. We've got to make, sometimes there's not a lot of time to have that debate and make that news judgment. But what I have tried to do, and we're all individuals covering this incredibly challenging and interesting beat right now, is to try to focus as much as possible on what he is doing over what he is saying. Now, he's the president. We know that what the president says is a big part of the power of the presidency, the bully pulpit and all that, so you can't, but try to focus on the substance. So I'll give you one very specific example and how it can also go off the rails no matter your best intentions. He tweeted one morning, I don't know if you remember this, he tweeted a personal attack on Mika Brzezinski in her appearance. And I saw that, and I got all on my high horse and said, we are not going to report this. It doesn't matter. He just insulted somebody. I don't want to repeat the insult. It's not going to affect anything in the country. And this other, I forget what else was going on that day, but there are 3 other really important storylines moving on. So that was my
Those are a line in the sand.
Yeah. And then within a couple of hours, the Speaker of the House is asked about it, and he's criticizing the White House. And this, you can't ignore the top Republican leader in Congress criticizing the Republican president. And then it became, by the end of the day, I lost control, and it was the big story, and I couldn't really even argue.
Let's end on John losing control and move to the next question. I want to get a student or younger person who's masquerading as a
Margaret,
student.
there's been a couple of women in here, and
Yes.
both have had.
Oh, goodness. Where's our moderator? Where's our microphone holder?
Right here.
You choose a young person from the front. I don't want to choose. Too much pressure.
Hi, my name is Hannah Thacker, and I was wondering, given the sheer amount of stories that we have coming out of the White House, how do you, as a journalist, decide what's newsworthy and what's not? My best example is the Stormy Daniels case. Do we, as Americans, decide that that is of great importance, of more importance than dealings in South Korea? How do you balance that?
That's a great question. By the way, do you think it's an important story?
No.
And why do you think it's not an important story?
Because I believe America's international standing is more important than the president's personal relations.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anyone?
Well, most of the time, most of the time, you're making at least when I was reporting, you made a kind of an educated guess. But it involved an awful lot of things. It involved, what do you think the people are interested in? What are your editors interested in? What else is going on? There's some very important stories that don't get covered because something else that is a more important story is happening the same day. There isn't any formula. I wish I could say that there was some magic way you decide what is the most important story. If there is, I never drank that elixir. I don't know what it is.
Let me know.
I do think this, and I'll give you my opinion. I think one of the things that sells is salaciousness, and there's no question that the Stormy Daniels story has, for my, is it as important as North Korea? Not remotely, but it's the kind of story. Any sort of involvement in the modern times, by not just a president, by any person who's important in an important role, that gets a lot of coverage. But I think the Stormy Daniels story, well, I don't give a hoot whether he slept with Stormy Daniels or didn't, or why, or anybody else. But I think the Stormy Daniels story has become a window into a story that's extremely important. And the story that's extremely important, which has been reported this week, and you're probably aware of it, is that President Trump lied about the fact that he had not made a payment for her. And I don't know that I knew this until I read the story, but he omitted it on his report last year. I think it's going to be a kind of question, probably going to be a close question, did he submit the report before he made the payment? But it's a sworn statement. That's a statement you're submitting under oath. I would submit that if a president of the United States might have lied under oath or is accused of lying under oath, that's a hell of a big story, and it doesn't really matter whether he's lying under oath about Stormy Daniels at that point, or North Korea, or anything any issue.
Hannah, not to put you on the spot, but I will, since we're all having so much fun with this. I do want to ask you, do you have an instinct about, if this were President Obama we were talking about, whether that would be an important story, and whether it would be a story that Americans were more interested in or less interested in? Would you be more or less interested in that story if it were about President Obama?
I think that as a Republican, I'd be more interested in it.
That's an honest answer.
That's a really good answer.
Very honest answer. I like that.
Let's go. I want to go to you because you've had your hand up for a while.
My name's Wayne Smith. I got some questions more about
We have a...
Oh, let's get the microphone. And thanks for your patience.
It's more addressing the media. I'm a Vietnam vet, served 68, 71. I was drafted. And obviously anybody that served during that war.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome. Thank you. And I'm still alive to tell the story. Agent Orange is trying to take me down, but I've fought it. Well, when you walk into USC and they just said, you've got more cancer than anyone ever walking through my front door, that's something to be said, but that's another story. Obviously, we all know what happened to the Vietnam vets that came home. I lived through that. I joined the National Guard. At least they gave me a gun. I had some way to protect myself being in the Guard. And hey, as long as I'm going to be represented, that's why I did it. But the media really did a lot to make it look bad for us. I mean, I don't know how many of you in here are vets, but I mean, it was a rough time for me, really rough. Rougher than being there and losing 80% of my unit. I was a helicopter pilot there, still fly helicopters. But the thing I've got with the media is I remember the Cuban crisis. And I remember when Russia was basically arming Cuba. And I look around this room and I see people that are maybe as old as me or maybe a little older than me. But we all remember that day. And I remember the people walking into these stores and cleaning every single roll of toilet paper out of there, every piece of food out of there. And it seemed that the media had a heck of a lot more to do and say and convince the people, like myself and others, to arm themselves. You've got to put a bomb shelter in your backyard. You're going to die. And we all got scared, and we all built it. Yet here we go with this missile crisis. You guys did a great job of representing it. We see missiles flying over Japan. And what did we do? We didn't do anything. I'd like to know from the media, why is the American people treating the media like, okay, so what? So we've got a steel embargo. So we're not being able to export soybeans, and it's wiping out the Midwest, and these people don't know what to do with their products. It almost seems like the media doesn't have the power and the oomph to be able to convince us as Americans that we got a problem here. Whether it's a president, the president doesn't do anything, and the president wasn't even voted in by the people. He was voted in by the Electoral College. The people voted for Hillary. We already know that. So, you know, to talk about the American people voting a president, and that hasn't happened in a while. But the Electoral College has really had the power to convince that. So my answer to you guys, and I know I've got the right people to ask the right questions, is why has the American people changed so much since the missile crisis in Cuba versus the missile crisis of people shooting this stuff over other countries, and we act like, oh, well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take a stab at it because I feel like you asked us a few questions, but one question that I heard in your questions was, for all of the resource that the media puts out a story, how come it is difficult to affect change through news coverage? And another question that I heard you ask is, does the media have a different attitude toward covering soldiers versus the wars that our soldiers are asked to fight than we did during Vietnam? I didn't come up in the Vietnam era. I was born about a week before the Watergate break-in, and so that's my frame of reference for understanding politics. But it's my sense, as being interested in politics and history and having covered the news for 25 years, that there is a difference now, that is a lesson that was learned by reporters in the decades following the Vietnam War, that critical coverage of war is different than the way we cover the Americans who rise up to the call of serving their country. And I see in the coverage a very different approach to that now than what I've read and seen in the coverage in terms of how the coverage of the Vietnam War played out. On the other question, if the question is about why the media throws so many resources and money at things but has a harder time corralling American opinion or behavior, I think it's for a couple reasons. And one is that this is an incredibly diverse country with so many different views that Hannah is going to be our spokesperson for this. I I think America has always been, it was always a collection of different colonies and then different states, and those places had different economies and different cultural threads, and people come from different places, and there's no, an American doesn't necessarily mean one thing. There's so many different ways to be an American. But also these times seem to me to be much more polarized and divisive than some times in the past, and I think the country goes through those cycles, and that the moment we're in now with sort of instant everything and Twitter is that the proverbial message is sort of shoot first and aim later, and it's made it very difficult to have the time and the space for Americans collectively to think about what we want and how we want to talk to each other and how we want to be, and it makes consistency of opinion, difficult.
I have two things. First of all, I think I utterly agree that the coverage of that Vietnam veterans got in this country at the time was disgraceful. But I think that's most people in the media feel that, and I think you see, I have people who are near and dear to me who've been in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I think you see a very different kind of coverage. I mean, I think that it's a much more, I don't know that it's a great coverage, but it's much more empathetic. It's much more understanding of what people go through, in combat, and what their relatives and their wives and their children go through. This other point that I'd say, you're using the media, and we've been doing it too, so we've been using it like it's a collective. The media is, at the time of the American missile crisis, was, you didn't have cable news. You had a few networks, and you had certain papers that were kind of lead papers. You had newspapers that were strong in every community. Many of those newspapers have gone out of business. The press is really atomized now. I mean, anybody can start their own podcast or whatever and there's no, the collective of the media involves so many different things. Breitbart's a part of the media that you're talking about, and I think we're too disparate, too scattered to have the kind of impact that you would want us to have or expect us to have.
Yeah, I would just say, again, thank you for your service. And I was born around the time of the Tet Offensive, so not a little before. So I didn't witness firsthand in a way that I was truly aware of what was going on. But Lou's exactly right. It was a disgrace the way American veterans were treated coming back from Vietnam. And I spent a fair amount of time covering the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and spent time with some of the most impressive people I've ever seen serving in our military. And during the height of the Iraq War, 2006, when we went from 12-month deployments to 15-month deployments in the Army, 15 months deployed in Iraq, come back, and then
go out again.
And they tried to get you to 12 months of home time, but sometimes it failed. Sometimes you were back before 12 months. And by the way, part of that 12 months stateside, you were not hanging out at home. You were in the training facilities that were set up on bases here to replicate what it was like to be in an Afghani or an Iraqi village. Really intense demands that we were making on very young, impressive people. And I think that the whole culture, not just the news, but the whole culture had much more of an awareness and appreciation. Still not enough, but more of an appreciation.
So I see more hands up. Do we have time for one more, or do we have to wrap it up?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
We're going to do one more question, and then I don't know how things happen so fast, but after we're done with the last question, we're going to break, but at least I will, and I think probably everyone can hang out for a couple minutes if you guys want to grab us afterwards, and then I hope you will all stay in touch by email. But all right, so let's do one more question. Where's our microphone? Let's get somewhere we haven't been. Can we go to the back right there? Yes, you.
This is my name is Eder Ruiz. I'm a senior in San Jacinto High School, and I'm also a DACA recipient. I just thought that'd be important, so you guys kind of know a little bit about me.
Yeah.
My question is for all of you, and I wanted to know if you guys, in the world of journalism, believe that there is a hierarchy to what kind of news takes precedent. Because although I don't believe that presidential affairs like the Stormy Daniels case or President Trump tweeting about insulting someone is as important as our global standing, it is important because it gives us a view into the actions of our president, and it lets the American people know if the actions and thoughts of the president are ethical according to their own morals.
So your question is fundamentally whether we believe there's a hierarchy of news and what the hierarchy is?
It's whether you guys believe that there is what is your guys' belief of what takes precedent? What should be the most important news?
Yeah.
I think Lou hit it with the, we need that elixir to tell us what the, it's a judgment call that's made every morning in newsrooms, and it's, we have the same debates and discussions that we have had here. And those are tough calls, and they're not always obvious.
I'll say it out loud and then see if it sounds right. I think a national security threat is probably considered or a public safety threat is usually sort of a preeminent thing on the hierarchy of news, right? If there is an attack somewhere, massive fatalities, a threat of something imminent, that is going to control the news cycle, and it should, because the news is fundamentally meant to inform Americans before it is meant to entertain Americans. Sometimes that gets upside down if there's something so provocative no one can resist. But basically, the point of news is to tell you something that you didn't know so that you can act accordingly, right? And then I think in terms of political news, what a president does almost always trumps what Congress does. And what the Supreme Court does often trumps what both do. Trump. I'm not using the verb on purpose. I just forgot. But what the Supreme Court does is often really important. They just don't do as much stuff as often, so there's less of that news. But if it's a massive, ruling that's going to shape American policy, that will drive the news. And then I think anything that is either revealed to be untruthful or that flips what we believed about something upside down, that also jumps into the hierarchy pot, because telling people about this revelation will fundamentally reshape the way people understand something. But I think they're like education policy, what your kids are learning in school, interesting information about plastic recycling. These are things that may make a difference in your quality of life, but they don't take up as much space on cable news or on the front page of a paper or the top of the screen on your iPad. If there's news like that doesn't come to the top of the hierarchy list but that you care about, you have to go find it yourself. And I know that's frustrating sometimes, but it is there, it is available. It just takes more work to find it. And we talk about this all the time when we go talk to groups about people say, what's news that I can trust? How do I know what websites I can trust? We need a whole other 6-hour forum for that, but the bottom line is you want to know where a news outlet is getting its information. Is it from a government report? Is it from a panel of scientists? Is it fact-based or is it opinion-based? And it takes some work to be a discerning news consumer. It does, it's easy to get buried under all of the information that's out there. There's a ton of information, and we're all seeing the ramifications of that now as we think about Facebook or misinformation campaigns or data mining. But this is the world we live in now, and so there's more information than ever, but it's not all reliable, and you got to do some homework to figure out what you can believe.
Covering a president's important, because what a president does or doesn't do can get you killed. I mean, that's more other people can too, but that's.
Yep.
Thank you. We're ending up on another uplifting note.
My usual upbeat note. I mean.
But he's right. Listen, we do have to wrap it up, but we are all going to stay for a couple minutes. And we just want to thank you so much, all of you, for being here. And please stay in touch with all of us. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.